Tom, are you having trouble with audio?
John, could you confirm that we have sound between us in the transition?
Yep, you sound good.
Okay, all right, I'll get started. Welcome this afternoon. Actually, it's probably still morning for some of you on the West Coast. Appreciate the opportunity to have a chance to talk about some of the things that we're seeing in the domestic and global energy markets. Certainly, it's a hot conversation right now in a lot of different sectors, not just in the specifically in the energy side, but certainly from a political standpoint and from a variety of different industry components as well. The first slide, title slide here might seem a little odd to some people that, we're not looking at something that's energy focused, but I think it's important for us to recognize that we might be able to see some of the factors that are around us right now and maybe gauge what some of those are on an individual basis. Maybe we have trouble sorting them out collectively. But I think one of the bigger challenges is being able to look forward. So we're somewhat blinded. We don't have a lot of historical perspective. We've seen a lot of down cycles in the energy market, but maybe not something that's as large scale as the one that we're seeing right now, as global as the one that we're seeing, and certainly the implications to our economies, whether we're talking about the US or Canada. I know both countries on the Zoom link here today, but certainly a lot of other economies around the world. So there's a lot of implications of this, and we'll talk about some of those as we go through the course of the conversation and the presentation here. This was actually just a group of our students and some virtual reality energy work that we're doing and some virtual tours we put together of the energy industry. So they're trying to find a new path forward, and I think, again, it gives some significance to the idea that we're all trying to do that as we sort this out right now. Just a little bit about the Marcellus Center. John did a real quick introduction. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it. Just two quick slides that I often show for people that are not aware of what we do. We cover a variety of things. As our name implies, we're both above ground and below ground. We're research and outreach both. And as you can see from the slide, just a quick list of some of the things that we have an interest in, some of the research that we participated in, and some of the different factors that we consider in many aspects of the work that we do at any given point in time. And you'll see a number of those issues reflected in some of the discussion that we're going to have here today. So again, we see ourselves as a very holistic group, looking at a wide variety of topics and recognizing that they influence a lot of the decisions that are being made at any moment in time and certainly on a global basis. But along with the research component, we also have the strong outreach piece. And a number of us are from the extension side in our particular universities, Penn State in this case, and that extension or outreach component where we're taking that research and breaking it down into its many components or smaller pieces and delivering that to the wide range of different stakeholders that we interact with on a daily basis, weekly basis, and certainly over the course of time. We see ourselves as providing a translational outreach, not creating not being an advocate of any one energy sector. So we're not trying to pick winners and losers. What we're trying to do is advocate for the science. What do we know? What don't we know? Where are the gaps? What are we doing from a research perspective to try to cover some of those gaps? And again, we'll have a chance to talk about some of those things here today. I made a quick slide to give you some kind of an idea as to what we're going to cover. I thought I'd start with the big feud that was going on, or it still is going on, between the Saudis and the Russians and the OPEC. We'll talk about the OPEC agreement. We'll talk about the pandemic and what that means for us and what part that plays in the market responses that we're seeing, and certainly the outcomes that are occurring and that we're seeing at the moment and what we can possibly anticipate going forward. So some of this is going to be looking at the here and now, and some of it certainly trying to develop a vision for what we're seeing right over the horizon, or maybe what is right at the horizon. We'll talk also, mix some components in here about storage and storage trends, talk a little bit about LNG, certainly the global recession that there's an argument, is it here now? Is it something right in front of us? How deep is it going to be? Is it going to be something that's more fleeting? So we'll talk a little bit about that, some of the factors that certainly are worth considering, again, as we think about that relative to energy. I think it's important to also mix in the renewables, and I'll explain that a little bit more as we get towards the tail end. But certainly as we see more renewables take a place in the energy portfolio more broadly, I think we need to mix them into the conversation here now as well to make this, again, a more holistic look at energy and what the implications are. Do a quick forward look, and then we'll also explore what I'm going to call some wild cards. What are some of those things out there that, again, if we're trying to look into the near future, maybe the midterm, what are some of the implications that could be hidden out there in some of these wild cards, and what do we need to consider about them? So we'll touch on them. So we think about the Saudi-Russian feud. Certainly many of you that are on the Zoom call here are familiar with that and have been watching that and some of the implications. I think that the biggest implication that we need to reference here is the fact that there's been just a beyond historic global demand destruction that's been caused by this pandemic. Some estimates are this is looking at somewhere between 25 and 30 million barrels per day when you're looking at a global utilization or production of somewhere around, we'll say production at this point of somewhere around 100 million. So we're talking, again, something that I'm going to keep calling beyond historic because we've not seen something with that type of drop in the past, and certainly not that quick. We also recognize that along with that demand destruction, you can start to break out different components. I chose to bring up maybe liquid fuels here. We can talk about aviation, for instance, because it's something that's often looked at when we see the number of airliners that are parked at some airport someplace waiting for hopefully a future passenger load that will recover at some point in time. But right now, some airlines are down to no flights on a daily basis or weekly basis, and some are down into 30% or 20% of their typical load. So the amount of fuel that's not being used, again, from the aviation industry is just an amazing number that is not being produced at this point. The initial response that came from this feud was by OPEC, was led by the Saudis, who are typically the leading voice when we think about where market adjustments or market balance is achieved because of the excess capacity that the Saudis usually bring to the table. So they brought that conversation out. They got a mixed response, less favorable response, we'll say, to indicate on maybe a softer way to judge that. But the Russian component in the OPEC plus dialogue, the Russian component was certainly less favorable to seeing some sort of a reduction. One of the reasons for that, one of the big reasons that's been speculated or been discussed, is the fact that the last time that there was a demand destruction on a barrel per day basis back during the financial crisis in 07, 08, a lot of the cutback that was achieved by OPEC was made up for by US producers. So the Russians, seeing that they lost considerable market share back in that same time frame and since then, wanted to make sure if there was some sort of a reduction this time, that there was going to be a reduction on the US side. And they wanted that to be on a more formal basis, which is a challenge for the US because of we're not part of a cartel like that, and we're not part of a organized type of a cutback. We'll talk about that in just a moment, another way. So the reality was there was a precipitous drop in price. You can see the number that I'm using there of a couple days ago of $19 US with WTI pricing. That number today I see has gone up into the mid 20s. I think it was just over $26 a barrel for WTI just a little bit ago today, a couple hours ago today. But the reality is that you're looking at single digits in certain regions in the North American marketplace when you're looking at certainly Western Canada and parts of the US where oil is being produced. So up in North Dakota, some of the price differentials in some of these different regions. Maybe we'll have a little bit of time towards the tail end of this and we can get some of those comments from some of the partners that are on the Zoom call here today. We also want to talk about the gas side, and I chose to break that out specifically, talking a little bit more about the oil, which is driving a lot of this. We'll come back around to the gas side, and what we're seeing in a similar fashion is the price of natural gas here in the U.S. is we're looking at sub $1, below $1 at many of the different pricing points. So that's a real challenge. There was some discussion. There still is some discussion out there. And again, we'll maybe cite some of the rationale for that. But could we actually get to negative pricing on a barrel of oil basis? We've seen that in parts of Texas from different times out there when we look at natural gas. But now we're talking about that potentially with oil. So a very unusual situation. And again, very hard to find some sort of a historical parallel that we can make for that. The reality was, or is, that created, and to some degree it's lessening, but I think there's still some storyline there that we'll talk about. But that created a price war. So the Saudis indicated, well, you know, if everybody's not going to play here and create a reduction in the amount of barrels, the volume of oil that's being produced, then they're going to produce full out. And they're going to bring the excess capacity that they have to the market. And one of the things that's unique with the Saudis is they have pre-positioned oil in storage in a variety of places around the world. So down in the Gulf, in places in Europe, Netherlands, in Egypt, in Japan. So they have pre-positioned oil that they can bring into the marketplace, assuming they make some adjustments in price. Russia was essentially saying the same thing, that if the Saudis were going to produce full out, the Russians were going to produce full out. And what you're looking at between the US, the Russians, and the Saudis is the three top producers in oil and exporters of oil on a global basis. So it's a very interesting dynamic. It's still going on. It might be lessening to some degree here for reasons that we'll discuss. But the reality is the price war is caused considerable damage to a lot of industry players in a wide variety of locations, pretty much all locations around the world. The Russians uniquely were saying that even though the price was dropping and roughly 60% of their national budget is based on oil, or we'll say hydrocarbons, because it's natural gas as well, they had a capital reserve that was big enough that they could make up the margin difference between what they needed for profitable oil prices and their budget and what the market might then offer. The reality was both countries were, and other countries as well chiming in, were also all trying to steal market share. So what could they get? How could they price product? What could they take from each other? Once this turned around, again, you know, what could they establish as new market share? Again, looking at some of the efforts that US production or North American production did with shale oil that came to the marketplace back in 07 and 08. Price war generated intervention. President Trump jumped in, others did as well, but President Trump apparently had a big part to play in trying to bring parties to the table, trying to intervene, and trying to come up with some sort of agreement that would limit the damage and certainly limit the price drop and bring the production of oil back in the profitable margins for North American production, certainly US production, through his intervention and other places globally as well. So different countries obviously have different price points as to what they need to have a profitable level of production. But the reality was that very few countries were at that level with where the prices had sunk to. I mentioned Mexico because in this intervention, the Mexicans were reacting to the amount that they were being asked to drop to or drop production levels by, roughly 350,000 barrels per day. And they were willing to agree to a lower number, with the US potentially stepping in and taking up some of that slack or offering to reduce some of that as well. The agreement starts as of May 1st. Essentially, it's an agreement for 2 months with some lingering decline in the agreement numbers over the course of time. So those numbers will decline through the end of this year and then going out 2 years beyond that. Question is, what about right now? You know, what's occurring at this point in time? Well, the reality is Both countries, certainly the Saudis in particular, are still pricing their oil at low numbers. Those numbers have come out recently, certainly in the Asian market. They're still trying to see some of that market share, and they're still producing on a flat out type basis to put oil into those same markets and try to seize some of that market. The reality from the broader market is this too little and is it too late? So the price dropped an 18-year low, about a 65% drop. You're looking from WTI dropped, as I mentioned, into the teens from originally when this started, from in the mid-40s. So quite a considerable drop, and as you can see, about an 18-year low mark that was hit. Commodity traders at the moment are still seemingly unconvinced, and more the conversation seems to be, can you do this through just an agreement, or are there other factors that have to come to bear? The agreement was looking at about 10 million barrels per day. I think it was 9.7 million barrels per day coming off the market as per the agreement. But as you saw in an earlier comment, the feeling seems to be that the oversupply right now is somewhere between 25 and 35 million barrels per day that is coming to the market that's not being needed because of that destroyed demand. There's been some efforts to reduce production in North America from a variety of different ways, certainly in the Texas, and I know we have some Texans online, but the conversation going on pretty hot and heavy in Texas right now. Do you prorate production? Do you bring production offline through state mandated reductions? Oklahoma looking at the same thing, or is this a organic type of market-based cut that would take place, some of which is occurring right now with wells being shut in a variety of places? But the assumption was that about 4 million bushels or barrels per day would come offline from Brazil, Canada, and the US. What the feeling seems to be is that the number that's going to be needed is going to be, again, in that 25-ish million barrels, and you're going to need additional reduction, either from the agreement or a combination of the agreement and some of this organic market-based cutback that would take place. In combination with that, there's also this idea that industrial nations that do indeed have strategic reserve storage capacity would step in and also make purchases in parallel. So that's something that's occurring right now in a variety of different places around the world. In the US, speaking from what's occurring here, there's two different efforts that's taking place in that regard. One that is more formal, the idea about leasing some of the strategic reserve to a number of companies. I think there's 9 that are being mentioned right now. Leasing some of the capacity to be able to store production in there for somewhere around a year's worth of time until the anticipated market were to come back with some payments that would be paid back to the government in a in-kind type basis with oil that would be left. But one of the things that we often see from low commodity prices is typically the cure for low price is low price. So the price gets low enough, somebody is going to step in and purchase that commodity, whatever it might be, because there's an opportunity there anticipated for that value, achievement of greater value in that over the course of time. So again, we'll see what occurs there, but there is some indication of that happening already, and we'll talk about that maybe relative to some storage as well. Refining has dropped off dramatically in some cases. Some companies, some refiners are talking about drops of 40%. I think I mentioned about aviation fuels. That is still probably being sorted out by the numbers, as I indicated, with companies, airlines. They're still cutting back some of their traffic and some of their aircraft loads. But refined aviation fuels as of last month were down 39%. So again, you can see some pretty dramatic drops there with wholesale and retail both. Wholesale gasoline had dropped to about 25 cents US a gallon in some locations. So some pretty dramatic drops there. The reality is that a lot of gas, and in this case, gas being refined gasoline and diesel as well, and jet fuel, but also crude in itself. And the reality, where is all that going to go? Looking for storage capacity. And, have we topped out? Is there still opportunities? I mentioned about the strategic reserves a second ago. But companies and states and countries are looking to, can they build out some new storage capacity? Can they find some additional capacity? Some of that capacity might be in existence already at refineries that have tanks that aren't full, some other storage in ground that's not full, some pipeline capacity that's not running at max, or the potential for even building some new storage capacity in different places. And I know North Dakota was looking at that on a state and industry basis. Some other locations are looking at the same, again, from a public standpoint and from a private standpoint. But there's also this idea, and it happened many times in the past, the idea about putting some of this capacity, some of the storage capacity on ships. So, boats that are still that aren't leased, aren't floating something from one place to another, some of those being filled and parked essentially offshore and waiting for price advantage, and back to what I said before about the low price creating opportunity in the future. That said, I mentioned a moment ago about the Saudis. Saudis are still loading ships, still sending, still looking at filling some of those low price orders that they see in Asia in particular. Not so much in the US, or it's been reduced to the US, but some of the other locations, Europe, some of the other locations that they've been sending, still be sending crude. The reality of all this, as you start to put all these different pieces together, is when will this market share realignment resolve? When will the rebalancing that's trying to take place right now resolve? And that's still an open question. We'll add some more pieces to it here that might shed some additional light. What we are seeing from a variety of different companies, and we'll reflect on this a couple of different times, but capital expense, CapEx, has been reduced by most every company. I've seen very few exceptions to that. And what we're also seeing is companies are going back and revisiting that again. So recognizing that this is a price environment that could go on for quite some time, and they're going to need to keep conserving cash and to reducing the outflow of capital as they're able to either have it already with some of their credit facilities, or be able to access it from the credit markets that are still willing, and banks that are still willing to make those loans at this point in time. Production cuts are occurring. Wells are being shut in. This is happening both in gas and oil. This is somewhat dramatic, and I imagine there's a number of people on the call that might be willing to make some comments about that, what you're seeing in your respective states and provinces, but the reality is that a lot of wells are being shut in, and production is organically falling because of that same aspect. As we step forward and start to look over the horizon a little bit, the reality is that, and I had an industry player talked to me yesterday specifically about this, but once you start to see all this production go offline, prices start going to creep up, and the question is going to be then, just like maybe we're seeing in the stock market, the stock prices are moving up and people start to take profit back out, and it starts to move back up, and the same type of thing. So with pricing, in this case with oil and gas, we're going to see the same type of creep upward with some of the production cuts that are taking place. And will we see flooding come into the market in the midterm maybe, and price volatility return because of that? One of the concerns that certainly industry is reflecting on right now, certainly some of the small and mid-sized players that maybe have not gone through this type of situation before and shutting in wells. One of the big concerns when shutting in wells is certainly water. When we're talking about gas in particular, but water coming in, flooding some of those same wells, and causing problems, technical problems, when they try to reopen those wells going into the future. So some of the considerations that certainly we need to be thinking about. Some of the other more broader global considerations we start to reflect on here as we see a much bigger picture here. We've seen in some countries licensing rounds that are being suspended. Some of them going offline, concerned that there's not going to be enough market interest, they're not going to get the price that they're looking for. And the companies that are indeed conserving cash are not going to step into those locations and be bidding in markets or into new locations that might be more speculation. So companies trying to find and work with higher grade investment options that they have, meaning resources and reservoirs that they have, that they might understand the geology better. They might have a better political infrastructure there, meaning the contractual arrangements and political arrangements within a particular country might be more predictable. So investing in those locations versus some of these more speculative type of locations globally. As companies are moving to conserve cash, certainly we see more and more of the oil field service companies that are hunkering down, taking more of their capacity offline. Certainly well completions, that's been a big part of this. Some of the drilling that's occurred, some of the production that is still coming online from wells that have been completed, filling some of the gap, but our company is going to be completing wells that have been drilled, and the answer seems to be pretty clearly that's going to be greatly reduced, unfortunately, for those that are in that aspect of the business. All that obviously is going to drive towards reductions in labor force. We're seeing fewer rigs, 200 rigs going off in the last 30 days. Actually, that number was looking in March, which has increased now as we step into April and looking beyond that, but we're looking at 600 rigs now, specifically in the US. Uncertain market conditions in the near term, I think that's pretty obvious by what we're saying here in this dialogue. The COVID-19 or the virus health issues impacting crews. A number of offshore rigs also have been dealing with that issue. So it's not something that's just in an onshore type of scenario, but certainly in the offshore environment as well. Bigger question, I think, is what's the new normal going to look like? And I want to address that in a little bit more detail, but just raise the question now as we start to think about this in this part of the presentation. And then beyond all this, what will the oil and natural gas demand return to, and when's that going to happen? So reflecting on that a little bit just a moment ago, we think about 2021 and maybe beyond, and certainly with the pricing agreement was put in place with the OPEC Plus nations. But are we going to return to what we had, or are we going to return to something that looks different than what we had in even the more recent past? Stepping into natural gas for just a moment as we keep moving through our slides, we've been seeing increased production year on year. There's an expected drop as we step into May. We certainly have fewer rigs that are operating in the primary basins. The graphic there gives you some idea as we look back into March. And we were seeing, the big 7 basins as we look across the U.S. and the assessments that EIA has put together and some of the numbers that they've been tracking. Certainly the Appalachian Basin, when you look at the Upper Devonian, but specifically the Marcellus and the Utica, and what that has meant in that location, and again seeing the trends, strong trends upward, but across the nation, and again for the most part, mostly upward in those locations. We need to also be talking about associated gas. So as we see less oil, shale oil is being produced, less associated gas coming from those same wells as more of those wells are being shut in, less of that gas coming online and going into the grid, and certainly making a difference from production as it shifts around the country from place to place, or North America, I should say, as it shifts from place to place. But current low price is driving, is due to low power demand that we're seeing with less industry that's online right now. Again, we'll reflect on that. We've had 2 successive warm winters in the Northern Hemisphere. That is certainly making a big impact in the amount of gas and the price for gas. And then beyond all that, still lots of gas chasing a market that's not asking for that. On the upside, or it could be considered that way maybe, is the share of gas-fired power gen is up. The PJM regional marketplace is still bringing on considerable amount of natural gas-fired power plants. We're talking mainly 500 megawatt plants and larger, so still a considerable number of those plants that are coming online and displacing coal, and some others, nuclear to some degree, but certainly coal-fired generation. Along with that are the renewables, which we'll talk about in a moment, as they're increasing. But the reality is more gas-fired power gen there and more use in that regard as well. Industrial use had been increasing. Again, as we think about where we're at the moment with industry and the question as to when they're going to return, that's going to be one of the bigger questions we'll have to discuss. But less drilling, and there is some conversation right now about winter and winter as in the winter coming, and next early spring looking at prices in the $3 or $3.50 range for natural gas. Whether we'll achieve that is going to be, I think, largely driven by our people going back to work. Where's LNG going to go? And certainly where is industry going to be? Thinking about LNG, there had been a strong demand for LNG. It had been increasing essentially year on year. Certainly production was going that way. And the market was asking for that, but new market conditions, as we're all thinking about right now, is really the big driver as to where that is going to end up. Europe has been the key destination for a lot of the Gulf and certainly Eastern U.S. capacity, most of it coming from the Gulf, as well as some of the West African production going into the Europe markets as well. Most of that at spot market pricing, which is relatively low right now. India has just turned away. They were one of the top buyers in the first quarter of 20, but it recently have turned away a number of cargoes that have gone to Bangladesh and some of the other nearby countries as well. But what we are seeing is there are some cargoes that are now going to China. I think there were 4 that are now afloat and heading that way. Looking at China open up some of their industry that had been shut down, and the expectation that more demand will be there, but that's still to be seen. And the other component is looking at Latin American purchases, which I'll mention in just a moment. You can see in the graphics on the left-hand side, up through the end of November anyway, U.S. increasing natural gas exports to Europe, but other countries as well. And the graphic in the bottom left-hand corner, you can see where most of that was coming from. Other questions or components in the conversation with LNG and some of the trends, more exports going from the U.S., certainly in pipe and ship. It's interesting when you look at the graphic on the right-hand side through the end of 2019, nudging right up to the beginning of the year that we're standing in, we're seeing essentially a 2 billion cubic foot per day increase in the amount of gas that's being exported out of the U.S. either by ship or by pipe. By pipe going into Eastern Canada or into Mexico, certainly by ship going to some of the places that we just talked about. We are seeing new technology being deployed, dozens and dozens now of these floating storage and regasification units that are being parked in a variety of harbors and different locations around the world that are giving flexible offloading capacity to gas as it's being shipped as LNG by a variety of different countries. So again, that's creating increased numbers of opportunities in different locations where that capacity, onshore capacity, had not been in place in the past, and now much more flexible offloading capacity in going into the near term, and certainly the current moment that we're standing in as well. Price is a problem. We're looking at $3.50 gas LNG landed price in a variety of different markets on a global basis, some upwards of $5. But the reality is, when you consider the price of the gas, the price of the production of LNG, onshore production of LNG, preparing it for export, and then the underlying costs of the commodity, the reality is that it's at cost or below cost, and some of that will likely come offline in the near term. Long term still looks to be, assuming the market turns around, industry turns around globally, depression or the recession is not too bad. That could speak well for opportunities again in the midterm. This also, as you go back to the solution for low price is low price. When we think about commodities, the amount of coal production or coal generated power gen out there is still relatively high, but with this commodity finding its way, and certainly with these FSRUs being parked where they are, that coal conversion to natural gas is certainly something that's going to be a big opportunity in the future. So when we think about recession, I think the question is not a what if, but a how long. There's lots of questions. Is this going to be shaped as a V or a U, or some are talking wheelbarrow shape, lots of different suggestions as to what this might be, how long it's going to be. But the reality is that's going to be a very important part of this dialogue going into the future. There's also a conversation about funds. Funds from some of the global funding institutions moving to some of the developing countries to make credit available. Credit available, that is also money available to be able to purchase some of this energy as it's being exported. So that's a conversation that we want to be following as well. There's also a similar dialogue about doing a timeout on loan payments from some of the developing nations around the world, and what's that going to mean to the credit markets, what's that going to mean to the inflow and outflow of credit and investment dollars into some of those same respective countries. We're looking at that in particular in some of the Latin American countries right now as to what that's going to mean in terms of their domestic industry, or what that's going to mean for some of the energy that they're buying from some other locations, including North America. But the reality is we're seeing with less industry, we're seeing less power gen because we're seeing the energy demand or electric demand decreasing at the moment. So that's something that everybody's going to be watching here closely, and certainly that's a factor when we think about pricing. I'm going to skip down to the bottom two statements. So we think about the industry and this turnaround from industry from a governmental basis. There's been a very strong recognition of where energy, and we think about energy more broadly here, thinking about renewables as well as fossil energy, and the place that plays in the workforce and the economic vitality of any particular country now and going forward. So investments that are made by governments to retain or to allow capacity, workforce capacities to stay in place is going to be vital. Quickly, when we think about renewables, the part that they play in the conversation, trying to mix in and make this a little broader, we think about before the virus hit and the implications of that. You can read down through the lists of some of the things that I think are important. Certainly we saw cost trends that were going down for deploying wind and solar in particular. Market-based and government policy-based deployment was certainly pushing upward. Again, as those prices were coming down, market forces were saying they were buying in, utilities were buying more of that capacity. But certainly as the economies were moving forward and showing a lot of upside, governmental policy was looking for bringing more of that renewable opportunity into the marketplace. There were subsidies, tax incentives that were there, employment was increasing, strong build out we're seeing on a global basis, lots of different countries in Africa, for instance. We're seeing opportunities in renewables. We're seeing quite a bit of that in Latin America as well. Supply chain was increasing, and certainly there was a societal interest based on climate initiatives as well as cost market incentives, but certainly relative to climate. So what's happened since? Tax benefits expiring, and that's been problematic, or it's anticipated to be problematic by the industry. We're seeing state and national and provincial budgets that are certainly being stressed and impacted in a major way. So that leaves the question open, is the renewable or some of these policies that were being pushed forward, are they going to be a top priority now, or are states, national governments, and provincial governments going to be looking at other more pressing issues that they might see coming to the forefront? In other words, a reshuffling of priorities leading to a change in policies, a change in capital, and potentially a change in workforce that would be associated. Quickly, just showing some of the trends as you look at trends and some of the predicted trends over time. Again, looking at natural gas and renewables in particular trending up through the year 2040. This was from looking back at EIA just a couple years ago, but we were seeing those trends being pretty comparable to that as we looked at the present, other than at the very present moment right now. Looking forward, just trying to see into the horizon just a little bit. Obviously, the pandemic is going to come to an end. Talk about why here just very quickly, but the reality, I think, as we step forward, is we're going to see a marketplace that has fewer firms, certainly some of the smaller, mid-size type enterprises that are less capitalized, going bankrupt. Some of that's occurring right now. Some of the bigger, more capitalized firms buying up some of that opportunity, some of the banks stepping in and doing the same, and then likely reselling some of that. Also tried to pick out something else. What about EVs? We're seeing more and more conversation about EVs, electric vehicles, and will they keep trending the way that they were? And it was a challenging marketplace for them to find their place in. But with the current financial stresses, whether that's governmental or at the personal level, with families making decisions about buying their next car, are they willing to buy an EV that typically is priced at a higher price point, or are they going to go back to more of the gasoline and diesel powered vehicles? So is that going to lengthen out the fuel transmissions that are taking place? And then what's that going to do again to some of the broader transition conversations that are being driven by some of these financial and climate-based conversations? Last thing I want to touch just real quick there, and John, I know we're coming closer on time, but as we think about this debate that's taking place now with these economic stresses, if you went back maybe 12 months ago or so, or maybe a little bit longer than that, conversation around the Green New Deal in some circles would have been trillions of dollars to fund something like that. That's crazy. It never happened. Now we're seeing stimulus packages that are in the media every day that are trillions of dollars, and more people that are becoming more and more comfortable with the idea that that type of money could be spent on something, and even additional stimulus packages to that level into the near term. So I think people are becoming more acquainted with some of this type of money being spent, and something like the Green New Deal, or at least some of the components of that, might not seem so far off depending upon what the political dynamic is. Which brings me to some of these wild cards and some of that political component in itself. I think the U.S. presidential election is certainly one of the more unique ones that all of us have been able to watch over the course of time. It's a election process, or certainly a campaigning process like we've never seen in the past. The question is, who's going to make it into that office, and what's that going to do for some of the policies that are going to come from whoever holds that spot in the after the next election. So are new climate policies going to prevail, or is there going to be less attention to climate? Again, going back to what I was saying about maybe the UVs or EVs, and our companies, governments, personal decisions, or collectively as countries, are we going to be interested in funding some of these policies that were being put in place? And we're already seeing some countries that are backing up from some of that conversation. Certainly some of the European countries are doing that right now. So it's an interesting dynamic, and I think it'll be a very interesting one for all of us to watch. I mentioned about temperatures in the past, a couple warm winters. Where's that going to go in the future? What's that going to mean for low prices, and are we looking at low price for longer, which has been kind of the some of the jargon here over the last couple of years. Certainly that seems to be a big part of the dynamic now. Mentioned about the SMEs, or the small and medium-sized enterprises. Also mentioned about the last quarter, or maybe stepping into first quarter 21. What's that going to do to natural gas prices? But I think one of the big questions here is the demand that has been destroyed up to this point ultimately going to be recovered? And that's why I tried to bring in a wide variety of different topics here that I think are some of the factors that we need to consider as we see the implications of that. So the shape of the recovery is going to be key. The vaccine timeline, I think, is going to be a big driver in this. That seems to be more of the conversation, along with widespread virus testing. But it would appear that, at least at this point in time, that the highest level of comfort is going to be when there's a vaccine and people are vaccinated, and then go back to some sense of normal, whether that's back to a factory or back to the energy field or back to whatever the type of work is, and people start spending money in the fashion and buying energy in the way they've done in the past. So with that, John, I think I'm going to stop, and I'll move on to, I think we have a few minutes here, and we'll try to move on to questions. I think there were some that came through, and we'll go to those right now.
Tom, thank you very much. You covered a broad range within that topic area with a lot of information. And if folks, there are a few questions in the Q&A pod. If there are other questions you'd like to perhaps have answered, please put them in there. And Tom, I don't know if you got it opened up as well, looking in there. And Tom, as we get to these, I'm going. And I didn't introduce our technical wizard and I would say webinar mom that watches over all of us and makes sure things go smoothly, and that's Dana Ollendijk, and she's the female voice you hear here once in a while that tries to keep us on track. And Dana's going to put up a poll just to get a feel for your responses of how it went today, and if you got some valuable information. This is really information we use, and so if you would be so kind as to answer the couple questions that Dana's going to put up, we really would appreciate it. And with that, Tom, I don't know if you see them.
All my questions I just added. Tom could answer some questions. I will launch it in just a few minutes.
Oh, that's fine, Dana, not a problem. Tom's got a couple questions here, and Tom, I don't know the first one, whether you see it or not, is the question says, is $4 an MCF natural gas still the break-even price for shale gas drilling? And when will we see that again? Now, I'll open up that crystal ball.
I think the reality is two things. One, maybe just the straight up on the question is $4 still the break-even price for shale gas drilling? And the reality is it depends on the company. You know, we get asked that question quite a bit. It depends on the company, depends how close you are to the market. Depends if you have who your buyer is on the other end of the pipe, meaning what you have contracted. It also depends how much you have how much you have hedged. So there's lots of different factors that go into what break-even price is, and what we're seeing is break-even price is different for different companies, and certainly in different locations around around North America. So it's pretty hard to answer that particular question unless you come down to a specific company and location. But the other question about when are we going to see it again, I tried to reflect on that when I mentioned about where the market seems to be looking when you look out through the end of fourth quarter 20, and certainly as you step into the beginning of 2021. Price seems to be trending in that regard and in that direction. But whether we're going to hit $4 gas, I think there's still a lot of steps that we have to go through here, all the way back to what I mentioned maybe as I was finishing with vaccine and people shopping and industry coming back online. There's dialogue right now in a variety of places around the world, different parts of Europe, for instance, Italy and Spain and Austria. There's Czech Republic. A couple of different countries now are allowing some of their smaller firms and smaller retail shops to go back, and some manufacturing to come back online. So that dialogue is taking place in North America right now. How much of that we'll see and how quickly that comes back, likely in a phase type of a step-by-step type process is what most countries seem to be saying. That'll make a big difference in terms of what we're going to see in terms of the energy price and when we're going to get to the level that we're mentioning there.
Thanks, Tom. Early on in your discussion, you mentioned about, you talked about storage, and you used the term prepositioned. Could you describe that a little more, please?
Sure, John. What that's referring to is, there are some countries that are exporting oil. In this conversation, we're talking about oil, but some countries are exporting oil essentially on a just-in-time basis. So they'll put it in a boat, ship it someplace, and offload it, and it's being converted into whatever. The Saudis have a arrangement that they actually have some that's pre-positioned in storage or have storage capacity in a variety of places around the world. So essentially what they're doing is they're offloading to storage or offloading into the market depending upon what that opportunity, where that opportunity is for them at that moment in time. So they can actually hold or actually do hold some pre-positioned oil in some of those different markets that they can move into that market on a demand basis that has market advantages to them.
Thank you, Tom. You used the term, the acronym SMEs. Could you describe that again?
Yeah, SMEs, what we're talking about, sorry for the acronyms. I guess there's lots of different acronyms. We should try to stay away from them as often as we can. But that refers to as small and medium-sized enterprises. We'll just think small and medium-sized businesses. When we think about the energy realm, whether we're talking about the renewables that I touched on or whether we're talking about oil and gas, and I realize most of the interest online here today is oil and gas, but we're talking about many of those smaller companies that are providing goods and services into the, or to the industry. So some of those might be small companies that are providing rental type equipment, construction equipment, light standards, things, at a really small scale, or other ones that are providing other more mid-sized type opportunities, including some that might even be in the seismic, doing seismic work or things of that nature, or trucking of materials, on a larger scale, or even some of the rail, smaller rail enterprises that are out there. So the question is, how many of those are going to be still in the game after some of this sorts out and this rebalancing occurs and the price comes back to something that is profitable for companies to be operating. And I think that's one of the biggest red flags that companies are, and certainly governments are looking at right now, as they're trying to keep workforce in place and trying to keep companies viable until hopefully the vaccine or a vaccine or multiple vaccines come to the marketplace and leads to an uptick in demand, or actually more than an uptick, but a big jump in demand, and back to something that's more normalized. Again, I think one of the, and I tried to illustrate, you've got a variety of things going on here with restructuring, the potential restructuring or conversation about restructuring economies. There's still a big climate conversation going on. There's a uptick in potential uptick in activity going, looking into the future, not at the moment, but looking in the future with more renewables. So how much of that demand is going to come back for oil and gas? Or is some of that going to just change because we're changing our lifestyles because of what we've just gone through, or we're changing our vehicle types potentially, yes or no? There's just a variety of factors, and I'm trying to illustrate what a number of those are so we can keep an open mind and think about those as we're considering what that demand might look like in the future. What will normal look like? So.
Tom, thank you for that. We've got about 3 more questions and time for one, and I'll say to those questions we don't answer, we'll attempt to get an answer to you. Just unfortunately, we won't be able to share it with the whole group here. So Tom, with the last question here, will New York State's ban on fracking affect activities in neighboring states? And do you think as it does affect neighboring states, is it in a positive or a negative way?
It's an interesting question, John. I think straight up, the ban on fracking impacting activities in neighboring states, I don't know is going to, if you have leasehold there, it's a negative. If you don't have leasehold there, do we have enough capacity? Do we have enough reserves and volume capacity in other states to make up for what potentially would have come from New York? And the answer clearly is yes. So, in that regard, it's not going to have a lot of impact in terms of the volumes of gas that might be produced. But along with the ban, I think there's a couple other considerations there that might be the most impactful. One of those is pipeline. That's been a big part of the dialogue up to this point. And certainly along or paired with the ban on fracking is certainly the essentially what appears to be a ban on new pipeline capacity going through. So that would be a negative in terms of implications for surrounding states, including the state of Pennsylvania that's been trying to ship gas up into the New York marketplace, or gas up or not New York marketplace, but the New England marketplace. The same thing with New England trying to get gas from lower cost gas from down in the mid-Atlantic states versus bringing it in by ship or by other means. So I think that's an important consideration. The last one I'll mention in here just really quick is part of that budgetary process the governor just went through was a new renewables siting process. And I think that's going to have implications that might reach beyond New York as well, meaning the siting of renewables projects and a streamlined effort to make that happen. So I would see that as something to keep an eye on, and what the implications are, positive and negative, in some of the surrounding states, but in particular Pennsylvania, where there's a lot of shale gas being produced.
Tom, thank you very much. We really appreciate your expertise and the outlook you gave us today. We all live in that world and appreciate, and we kind of pick up bits and pieces in our daily reading, but generally don't put it all together like you just did. So we appreciate you and what you brought to us today.
Gladly.
With that, thank you. With that, I thank all of our participants. Thank you for joining us today. Thank you for those of you that filled out the poll. We appreciate the poll being answered. It helps us in the future. We will be back here on Tuesday afternoon at 1:30 p.m. Eastern Time. Beth Powell, who is the CEO of New Energy Development, New Pig Energy, will talk about oil and gas development containment, regulations, and BMPs. So if you have an interest in that, you'll soon be getting an email invitation to join us. We are attempting, within the confines of speakers' availabilities, to be here on Tuesdays and Thursdays at 1:30 p.m. Eastern Time. And we'll attempt to do a little better job of giving you an idea what's coming up so you can plan a little better than this rapid fire bunch of emails that you respond to. But we appreciate what you have, how you've done that, and we appreciate your participation today. So with that, again, Tom, thank you for your considerable expertise for today's program, and we'll look forward to seeing you all again very soon. At the very least, we'll see you maybe next Tuesday afternoon. So thank you. Have a good day, everyone. Thanks again.
Thanks, everybody.